Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us in this little bit of Hebrew as we're in the middle of the week and looking today again at Daniel chapter 10, verse 2. And as you see on our screen, a little short verse, but many things packed into it. So in those days, Daniel was in mourning 3 whole weeks. So I'd like to read the Hebrew for you just to help enhance your understanding of it a little bit. And so you get to hear what Daniel and the Jewish people have been studying for thousands of years. So by Yamim Haim, that's in those days, Ani Daniel Hayiti Mit Abel Shalosha Shavuim Yamim. What's interesting here is it's translated into English as 3 weeks full, but the Hebrew is really Shalosha, which is the number three, and then Shavuim means um, sevens. And so it's really saying 3 sevens, and then Yamim at the end is really the word for day. So it's 3 sevens of days. And so obviously that wouldn't translate very well into English for us English speakers. And so the understanding there is that it's 3 full weeks, or so it's again interesting to the reason I brought that out is to understand the Hebrew mindset and how they looked at time. And so with that in mind, we're going to hang on to that. So I read for you the Hebrew, been learning the cantillation or the chanting of it, and this is a fairly easy one as I'm learning it. So just to give you a flavor for it, if you were ever to sit in a Jewish Orthodox synagogue where they might chant this, and so it would sounds maybe something like this: Bayamim ahem ani Daniel. Hayiti mitabel shelsha shavuim yamim. So again, just a beautiful melody, and this is how they would have learned. This is how they would memorize it, and very grateful to be able to learn some of these enhanced meanings by that. So, with that, we're going to jump into the meanings behind this because there's some interesting words. Like, first of all, why was Daniel feeling the need to mourn for 3 whole weeks? Obviously, he had a very disturbing dream and it really bothered him. But where does this 3 weeks come from? So, to kind of take a look at that, we look at our Jewish JPS version and read the commentary here. And it talks about he was mourning. And we understand what mourning is, but I think the idea of mourning in a Midwestern culture is very different from that of a um, Middle Eastern culture. We see that unfortunately in the news when we look at the tragedy that's happening over in Gaza right now and the terrible hardships and the death that's occurring by the hour and minute over there. And you see the anguish on their faces and you see the mourning in a way that is challenging for us to relate to. Yes, we have tragedies here, but it seems that when we compare when tragedies happen here in the United States, the amount of anguish that we see on people doesn't quite compare to what we see when we are, um, viewing those short clips of what we see happening over there. So where does this come from? Why so much emphasis on mourning? Here in the Jewish commentary, it puts a reference of Genesis chapter 41 in the Roman numerals. So as we just take a quick look at where this is referencing, I would have never put these two things together. But what they're referencing here is the um, episode where um, Joseph has is interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams. Remember, Joseph is in prison, and the Pharaoh has a dream, and these dreams trouble him. But notice that in these dreams, there's references to sevens. There's three groups of cows, um, animals that talk about them in sevens. And for some reason or another, this has to do with the mourning period of why Daniel chose um, three groups of seven, or the th three full weeks, but it references back to these seven cows that came up three times um, in the book of Genesis in Egypt, predicting the famine that was going to come. And I find that very fascinating that this would have made that kind of reference. But obviously, this was a very tragic time for them that was coming up. Egypt was going to go under famine. Is the land of Israel, which didn't exist at that time, but Jacob, known as Israel, lived in that area and was going to be affected by this. And that was a terrible tragedy that then led to the traveling to Egypt, which led to the slavery in Egypt and the delivery from Egypt. So obviously, this had some meaning for them. So going back to this time and the words that are given, we want to unpack this word for mourning, and it's mita baal. And as we look at um, the mem preposition, I mean from, comes from lament or to mourn, and find that it's very, very interesting here on what mourning has to do. And they all often associated mourning with putting yourself in a position to show your grief in a way that we don't do here in the United States. They use the term sackcloth and ashes quite often through the Bible, and you may see that this lament follows a death or great calamity, and unlike quiet sorrow, it conveys a public outward display of grief, tearing your garments, putting on sackcloth, which is not a comfortable um, type of clothing. It's meant to afflict you. It's meant to be rough. It's meant to cause you emotional, physical pain. Sitting in the dust, emitting wails or dirges, like funeral type dirges of bereavement. And again, quite starkly contrasting to what we do here in the United States, at least in our Midwestern um, type of culture. And I know there are different cultures that handle death and mourn in very different ways. And for me, it's very fascinating as a chaplain to investigate this and to know how to respect those different types of mourning that occurs during a time of death, and how it relates to getting through the time of mourning, and also the recovery and the um, pulling out of it is often aligned very closely with the type of grief that's emitted and how a person recovers. Some use the word heal from it. Others call it just a picking yourself up and moving on, and how you move on after such a deep tragedy is, many times tied in with the culture and with the family support that exists or doesn't exist in the culture. Our Midwestern culture seems to minimize these type of emotions, and but where other cultures will feel that there's a period of time that you need to go through to properly express your emotions, to properly vent your emotions, to bring about a release of those relationships and the sense of loss, and that then allows for a better healing and recovery. And again, it's a very fascinating study for those of you who may find interest of it. And I find it interesting from the standpoint that we look to the Hebrew scriptures to see how they suffered and how did they process it, and then how did God respond and how did God help them through this. And so we see a little bit of a key here with Daniel that he goes through this mourning process for 3 full weeks. Again, I just find this incredible that what is it like to go through this mourning process? What did Daniel do? And so we're going to see a little bit more of that as we go to the next verse. Verse 3, we see that during this mourning process, he did not take any pleasant food. So it wasn't that he completely um, kept himself from any food or any drink, but he didn't partake of any pleasant food. And we'll take a look at that word later to see what clue that could give us. Then it says that he did not eat meat or drink wine, didn't come into his mouth. Again, kind of a interesting um, support, or we'll call it a replication of words. Why couldn't he have just said, I didn't eat any pleasant food? But then he would have to say that it didn't come into his mouth at all. And he also didn't anoint himself for these 3 whole weeks. And so two of the words kind of stick out. And the first one is this pleasant food. If we remember back to the very first chapter of Daniel, we'll find that there was the story of the Hebrew children, Daniel included, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, coming into Babylon. And because they were favored, they were brought into the king's court and given this opportunity to study and to live in the king's palace, eat all of his food. But Daniel and his friends said, nope, we're not going to eat of the king's meat or drink of the king's wine. And caused kind of a bit of a stir, that the chamber master was kind of concerned that these guys were going to starve to death. And Daniel put forth a challenge and said, just let us eat pulse or vegetables and give it for a test for 10 days. Interesting why the 10 days there. And then we have 3 weeks of potentially 21 days here. Again, these time frames have meaning in their time, but are kind of lost to us today. Anyway, Daniel and his friends had the vegetarian diet for 10 days, and they actually looked better than the guys who ate all of the uh, pleasant food or meat or wine. So Daniel's no stranger to going on a reduced type of food diet, and so we know he's been through that. So let's see what pleasant comes to mean if we look at the Hebrew text. And it comes from the word hamad. And this is a word that's used in many different ways. First time is in the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden as a um, description of the trees that were in the Garden of Eden, that the tree had fruit that was pleasing to the sight, that you looked at it and you just wanted to eat it. It had the ability to, as the translation here says, create a desire, uses the word lust, it causes one to be attracted to it. And so this kind of interesting. Again, Hebrew is so cool in that it has these words that have deeper meaning than we maybe pick up in our English. And so this was something that when it was seen, you coveted it, you wanted it. It's also used in reference in the Ten Commandments of coveting your neighbor's house or your neighbor's wife or anything that's your neighbor. So this is some very strong feeling here that Daniel was keeping himself away from these type of foods that did more than just make him, feel not hungry or satisfy his hunger, but it also had an impact on his spirit, had an impact on his mentality. And so again, it makes us wonder, what kind of foods were these? Can we think of any food in our scenario of where we live? Is this, going to a very expensive restaurant and it has, they have food that are just very savory, and that when we eat them, is it combined with, as Daniel was saying, he didn't have any of the wine, so he had no alcoholic influence upon him to distort his thinking. The combination of really, really good food, overeating, makes you somewhat lethargic. We've all been in food comas, some would say, after a big meal, typically Thanksgiving meals and Christmas meals and festive things like that, where our senses are somewhat dulled. And I think maybe that's what he's getting to here is that he wanted to keep himself from being distracted. He didn't want himself to lose his focus. And so this word kamad is just very interesting. And then he says he did not anoint himself. This word anoint may trigger some thoughts of in the New Testament. We have the word Christ, which means anointed, which comes from the Hebrew word Messiah, which is an English transliteration of the word Mashika. And so here we're seeing a word that is pronounced Sakati, and it is not at all similar to the word that we're used to hearing for Messiah or the Anointed One. So, how is this anointing different from the Messianic or Messiah or Mashika that we've heard for the Anointed One? And again, this is very interesting. In English, you hear anointing, and but you don't know that there are differences. And so here we see that this word of suk, which is referencing just a fragrance, a oil that you put over, not for any type of coronation, not for any type of symbolism as far as being appointed or selected for any realm of special importance in the kingdom or any spiritual significance. This is pretty much like putting on your aftershave and cologne in the morning and washing your hair with a nice fragrance shampoo. This is the same type of anointing that Daniel's talking about. So again, I find that interesting to learn the difference in these words. And so this is just an act of rubbing oil on your body. And the topical scope of use points out that there is the other type that is employed for installing kings and priests. And that is the type that's associated with King David, King Saul, King Solomon, but also Jesus as being the Messiah, the anointed one, the one that's anointed for installation in a high position, being our King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so I hope you find this somewhat interesting. The Hebrew is just so beautiful, but in totality, we see that Daniel is afflicting himself. He didn't anoint himself with any good smelling ointments, which means his bodily odors were very much noticed for a whole period of time for 3 weeks. Doesn't appear that he washed himself, that he was really going into a time of self deprecation, a time where he was really afflicting himself. He wanted no focus to be upon himself. He wanted it all to be focused on this dream he had and interpreting the dream and seeking God to provide him with this interpretation and understanding it, and then also knowing how to present it. Because once he had this understanding, what was he going to do with it? How was he going to present it and how were people going to receive it? And so a lot going on Daniel's mind, heavily on his heart, as we can tell from these verses. So again, thank you so much for being a part of this little study. Next week, I'm out of town. We'll not have study next week, but look forward to rejoining you in 2 weeks and pray God's blessing upon you all. And thanks again so much for being a part of the study. Bye-bye.